Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. My name is Sukhman Kaur and I am the Associate Editor on the Guru Granth Sahib project. We are pleased to announce the release of the annotation of Bani Bhagat Sadhna, which is set in Rag Bilawal, a musical mode of excitement and accomplishment invoked as the seeker turns their face towards the Naam of IkOankar. Bhagat Sadhna is one of 15 Bhagat contributors whose compositions are included in the Guru Granth Sahib. There are many different accounts and different debates surrounding the historical facts of Bhagat Sadhna's life, including his family background, his religious upbringing, his contemporaries, where he lived, where he was from, which are all explored in great detail on our Historical Dimensions page on the website. But something that is both agreed upon by scholars and is critical to address this composition is Bhagat Sadhna's caste background. In Punjabi, the occupation, the caste label is Kasai. And in English, we would translate this as butcher, someone whose profession it is to sell, process, and handle meat. But in that moment of translation, that word suddenly sheds all of its cultural baggage, all of its cultural ties, and we don't really feel the full weight of that label anymore, which is so crucial to even begin to understand the context out of which Bhagat Sadhna becomes inspired to connect with IkOankar and composes this sabad as a result of. But we lose that sense in the translation of butcher, because that word it's a label, it's a demarcation, and it's also in some ways used as a condemnation. Historically, butchers in South Asia were marginalized by society and treated as if there was something inherent about their birth that made them undeserving or even incapable of connecting or being in remembrance of the divine. In South Asia, this means they were often subject to social exclusion and violence, and unfortunately the situation is not particularly different nowadays. You'll still find caste discrimination very rampant in all South Asian communities, whether in the continent or globally. And yet, Bhagat Sadhna gives us this insight into the nature of IkOankar. It speaks of the heart, it speaks to the heart, and it's an insight believed impossible for someone of his caste background. But we know that that's not true. We know that all people are capable of connecting with IkOankar. We know that all people have the ability to connect with IkOankar. So when we see caste being discussed in relation to Gurbani, in relation to Sikh history, it's not to say that regardless of caste, as if to say that caste does not affect people's lives, because it has material impact on everyone's life, but it's to say inclusive of caste and inclusive of different identities. It's kind of like saying, it's a means to acknowledge the lived realities of different communities and different identities, and say you too, and you also, and all of us together can connect to IkOankar. We've always had that ability to connect to IkOankar, and that ability is the thing that is inherent to all people, not these social constructions that we as people have created. One thing that I wanted to make sure to touch on is the Rahal line, since that's where the main idea of the composition can be found, and that is Tav Guna Kaha Jagat Gura Jo Karma Na Nase Singh Sarana Kat Jaye Jo Jambuk Grase Raha. And our team translates this as, what good is entering your sanctuary if the jackal-like deeds of the past will not leave me? Pause. Bhagat Sadhna focuses our minds on the idea of surrendering to the divine in this line. The lion here is symbolic of IkOankar, while the jackal, this animal that represents beastliness and ferocity, is representative of that which can devour us. Those actions, those deeds, those behaviors that are fueled by desires of all kinds, of all ranges, that we all struggle with, but that distract us from focusing and being in remembrance of IkOankar. And we can kind of think of this composition as a mirror reflecting our negative actions. And in this way, this significant mental obstacle of our desires has been animified as this jackal. It's a calling in of the self to pause and reflect on our behaviors and our actions so far in life. But it's still a rhetorical question in many ways. Can I be saved by the one from these deeds? What is the use of even seeking entry into the sanctuary of the all-capable IkOankar if our misdeeds are not first tackled at their root, our desire? How long will we remain in the shelter of IkOankar if our eternal jackal of misdeed guides our behavior and not the loving devotion and remembrance of the divine? This composition is also incredibly rich with symbolism, so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And there's other symbolism in the rest of the composition that I encourage you to explore on the website, but one that really spoke to me is one that we find quite often in Gurbani, and that is the Jatrik, the pied cuckoo, which is the image of patience and yearning manifest. And the line that it appears in is ek boond jal karne chatrik dukh paave pran gaye sa gur mile fun kaam na aave. And this is translated as, if the pied cuckoo dies while waiting for a single drop, it would be useless even if it were to find an ocean of water. This bird, this mythical bird, is said to wait for a specific raindrop that descends from a specific constellation. That's the only raindrop that it will want, that it wants at all. It's the only raindrop that will quench its thirst at all. Its cries echo its restlessness until that raindrop arrives. And in the same way, seekers too find no tranquility without the essence of Nam. So Bhagat Sadhna is using this imagery, this metaphor, the symbolism, you can say, by presenting the pied cuckoo as an illustration for seekers immersed in longing, yet remaining steadfastly patient. So it's not like that the Jatrik is like suffering, writhing in pain, and is just like beside itself. And it is a little bit, but it's in a patient and in a loving and in a yearning way, and in a way that there's like anticipation there, there's an expectation there, like that this raindrop will arrive. Maybe you're not sure when it's going to arrive, like when the essence of Nam will arrive, but you're certain that it will, because you know that you're able to do so. We can acquire this art of nurturing patience in our yearning, and we've learned that it's something that is in all of us. But the question remains, can we surrender ourselves in this way? Can we be vulnerable and let ourselves yearn in this particular way? And in the composition, Bhagat Sadhna talks about how even an ocean of water would not revive the Jatrik if the pied cuckoo were to waste away waiting for the drop of Nam. So in this way, I think the Bhagat Sadhna is suggesting that we can think of now as good of a time as any to yearn for IkOankar, that this opportunity, this human life that we've been given is our chance to connect with the divine. The final couplet brings us from a place of obstacles at the beginning of the composition to one of awareness, that we can in fact gain grace and tackle our desire. And the first line of the couplet is Main nahi kachhu nahi kich ahe na mora. And the team transcreates this as, I am nothing, I have no existence, you are my only support. And Bhagat Sadhna in this way acknowledges his own insignificance in presence of divine, and we're also moved to acknowledge our collective insignificance. It encapsulates this sense of profound surrender and connection and humbleness, and reflects a kind of awareness that shows the deep understanding of how human life is intricately connected to the divine. It's this recognition that the very essence of our being finds both its source and its sustenance in IkOankar. So in this kind of global persistent phenomenon, and this is this is things that have been happening since the beginning of time, basically. But this always like this push to classify others, to categorize others, to identify others, to be identifiable. And then this idea, the idea that this like dissolution of the self and the dissolution of ego is liberating, that even like the idea of anonymity, the dissolution of the self into this greater whole is liberating, really gives me pause in this moment. So in that way, I think, Bhagat Sadhna, prompts us to recognize, one, that we can surrender to IkOankar, and also to recognize that all of us, all of the entire creation is within the command of the divine. As always, we have word meanings for each word in this composition, and one that I wanted to just briefly touch on before I leave you with this reflection is the word Jun. And we've literally translated that word as human being, and the implied meanings on our website are servant and devotee. And I think in like the Western context, when you're thinking about the word servant, there's like inherent judgment there. It's understood as like a really negative role, and that's like for many historically accurate reasons. In English, when you think of servant, you think of like a maid, or like a stable hand, or like a chauffeur, or like a valet, even something. But it's almost like a condemnation, that this role and the labor associated with this role make that role inherently negative. But in this context, Jun, it's not a condemnation at all. It's a recognition of the lived realities. It's a recognition of that role and the relationship that is in that role. And it kind of superimposes this idea on our relationship with IkOankar. So we can kind of understand it in terms that make sense to us, in terms that are relatable, in terms that we've seen in life before. But it goes further, right? Because like as seekers, as people who are trying to be in remembrance of IkOankar, like in this way we can kind of better understand, or try to understand, what it means to be a servant, what it means to be devoted, because it's such a vast concept. I think it's difficult to describe, and so it kind of makes me reflect on that experience of like being a servant that is motivated by love and reverence and humbleness, because it's an excited surrendering of the self. It's an excited dissolution of ego and dissolution of the self, acknowledging that your life and your essence is the divine's. Like that's it, like that's the end all be all. And we see that excitement in the use of the word Jun. We see it in the particular rag Bilaval. We see it all throughout this Bani. So I think there's something really beautiful going on there, and I hope that you have the time to sit with this annotation and reflect on this annotation and what insights you might glean from it. There are word definitions, footnotes, translations, transcreations, commentary, all for you to explore, all for you to discuss and think about. I think Bhagat Sadhna demonstrates that everyone has the potential to connect with IkOankar. We're like inclusive of all of these different pieces of identity, and it's really worth reflecting on our ability to connect with Nam, and whether we are going to use this opportunity, this life, to become engrossed with Nam. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.